The morning fog clung to the university courtyard like cigarette smoke in a dive bar, thick enough that Professor Kestrel Nakamura couldn't see the library steps from her office window. She'd been grading papers since dawn, red ink bleeding across essays about international relations theory, when the first helicopter appeared through the gray veil. Then another. Then six more, their rotors cutting through the silence like chainsaws through silk. Students scattered across the quad, phones raised, capturing what they assumed was some kind of military demonstration or recruitment stunt. But Kestrel's coffee cup hit the floor, ceramic exploding against hardwood, because painted on the lead Black Hawk's fuselage in bold white letters was a call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 8 years. Nightingale. Her hands trembled as she reached for the desk drawer, muscle memory, guiding her fingers to the secure satellite phone she'd kept charged but never expected to use again. The screen showed 17 missed calls from numbers that didn't officially exist. The helicopters began landing in formation, their downdraft scattering autumn leaves and undergraduate schedules with equal indifference. Through her window, she watched soldiers emerge from the aircraft, their movements precise and purposeful, not the ceremonial guard units that sometimes visited campuses but operators, real ones, the kind who moved like water and spoke in glances. Their team leader, a woman with lieutenant colonel insignia and eyes like winter storms, looked directly up at Kestrel's third-floor office window. The satellite phone vibrated. Kestrel stared at the display. AUTHNTICATED Priority Alpha. Her finger hovered over the answer button. 8 years of teaching political science, of faculty senate meetings and tenure reviews and boring academic conferences. 8 years of pretending she was just another professor who'd never felt G-forces pull at her soul or talked to God at 30,000 feet. The phone kept ringing. Down in the courtyard, more students gathered, their excited chatter drifting up through the glass. They had no idea they were witnessing the end of Professor Nakamura and the resurrection of something far more dangerous. She answered on the seventh ring. Nightingale. The voice was crisp, familiar. General Patricia Hoffman, though she'd been a colonel when they'd last spoken, when everything had gone sideways over the South China Sea and 3 good pilots hadn't made it home. I'm retired, Pat. Not anymore. We've got a situation. Through the window, Kestrel watched the lieutenant colonel signal her team. Students were being gently but firmly moved back, creating a perimeter. Campus security stood helpless, their radios squawking with confused chatter from administration. What kind of situation? The kind where we need the best pilot who ever lived to save a lot of people from dying badly. Kestrel closed her eyes. Outside, engines spun up. The past 8 years had been borrowed time. She'd always known that. Professor Kestrel Nakamura reached for her coat, wondering if her flight suit still fit. The woman they'd once called Nightingale was about to find out if legends could be resurrected from the quiet desperation of academic life. Her students would have to wait for their grades. Some things mattered more than tenure. The helicopter's engines grew louder, drowning out her heartbeat. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching, but they were already too late. The military had come for their ghost, and ghosts didn't ask permission to haunt the living world again. Through the secure line, General Hoffman's voice cut through the rotor wash. Transport leaves in 5 minutes. Briefing en route. Copy that. The words came automatically, muscle memory older than her academic credentials. Kestrel grabbed her emergency bag, the one she'd packed 8 years ago and never unpacked, and headed for the door. Her comfortable life as Professor Nakamura was over. Whatever waited in those helicopters, whatever crisis had dragged her call sign out of classified files and onto active aircraft, would define who she was meant to become next. Students pressed against classroom windows as she walked across the quad, her stride shifting from academic shuffle to military precision with each step. Some pointed at her, recognizing something in her bearing they couldn't name. The lieutenant colonel approached, saluting with the kind of respect usually reserved for monuments. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, Special Operations Aviation Regiment. We're honored to have you aboard." Kestrel returned the salute, feeling 34 years old again instead of 42. "What's the mission, Colonel?" "Classified until we're airborne, but ma'am," Chen's expression was granite serious. "They reactivated your call sign for a reason. Whatever's out there, conventional assets can't touch it." The lead Black Hawk side door stood open, revealing tactical displays and communication equipment that hadn't existed during her active service. Technology evolved, but the smell of aviation fuel and the hum of turbine engines remained constants in a changing world. She'd missed both more than she'd admitted to herself during faculty meetings and dissertation defenses. As the helicopter lifted off, Kestrel watched her university shrink below, her office window growing smaller until it disappeared entirely. Somewhere down there, her afternoon introduction to defense policy class would find an empty podium and a note directing them to read Chapter 12. They'd never know their professor had once been the military's most classified weapon, or that she was about to become that weapon again. The radio crackled with encrypted chatter as they climbed through the cloud deck. Call signs and coordinates she recognized from briefing rooms that officially didn't exist. Whatever had brought Nightingale back from academic purgatory, it was big enough to risk exposing assets that had stayed dark since her official death 8 years ago. Through the helicopter's window, the world looked different at altitude. Clean, simple, binary decisions made at the speed of physics rather than committee consensus. Up here, politics became irrelevant and only competence mattered. She'd forgotten how much she missed the clarity. General Hoffman's voice filled her headset. "Nightingale, you're about to learn why we faked your death 8 years ago, and why we need you alive now more than ever." Kestrel checked her harness and prepared for whatever truth was waiting at 30,000 feet. Some secrets were buried for good reason. Others were just waiting for the right crisis to claw their way back to the surface. The helicopter banked east, toward answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, and a mission that would either redeem her past or bury it forever. Behind them, the university faded into morning haze, carrying with it the last traces of the woman who'd spent 8 years pretending to be normal. Ahead lay nothing but sky and possibility, and the kind of danger that made her feel alive for the first time since she'd walked away from military aviation. Professor Nakamura was dead. Nightingale was about to remember why she'd earned that call sign in the first place. The mission briefing began as they reached cruising altitude, classified folders emerging from secure compartments like classified prayers. Kestrel opened the first file and felt her blood turn to ice water. The photographs inside showed aircraft that shouldn't exist, engaged in activities that violated 17 international treaties and the basic laws of physics. Someone had been busy while Nightingale was grading papers about deterrence theory. Someone who clearly hadn't read the literature about what happened to people who poked sleeping dragons with experimental technology. The helicopter's engines hummed a familiar song as they flew toward a confrontation 8 years in the making. Kestrel Nakamura had been sleeping in academic camouflage, but the Nightingale had been dreaming of flight patterns and engagement protocols the entire time. Now both versions of herself would have to work together to prevent something that would make her previous classified missions look like training exercises. Through the headset, General Hoffman's voice carried the weight of buried secrets. "Welcome back to the war, Nightingale. Hope you remember how to fight impossibility." Outside the helicopter's window, clouds parted to reveal the first staging area, where aircraft that officially didn't exist were being prepared for missions that had never been planned. The sight of so much classified hardware in one location meant either humanity was in deeper trouble than the public knew, or someone had made a mistake so catastrophic that only ghosts like Nightingale could fix it. Either way, her quiet academic life was officially over. The real work was about to begin. The transport helicopter carrying Professor-turned-Nightingale descended through cloud layers thick as cotton batting, revealing a military installation that didn't appear on any civilian maps. Runway lights stretched into the distance like fallen stars, guiding aircraft that existed only in the fever dreams of defense contractors and the nightmares of enemy intelligence services. Kestrel's trained eye cataloged the impossible inventory spread across the tarmac. Stealth fighters with wing configurations that bent physics, transport planes large enough to carry main battle tanks, and in the center of it all, surrounded by technical crews and armed guards, sat something that made her stomach clench with recognition and dread. The X-47 Phantom, her aircraft, the one she'd supposedly died piloting 8 years ago over international waters where secrets went to disappear permanently. Its angular surfaces reflected the morning sun like black diamonds, radar-absorbent coating giving it the appearance of a hole torn in reality itself. She'd named it Whisper, back when nomming military aircraft was still allowed, before everything became alphanumeric designations and bureaucratic sterility. Lieutenant Colonel Chen noticed her stare. "She's been waiting for you. Maintenance kept her flight ready just in case." "In case of what?" "In case the people who tried to kill you 8 years ago came back to finish the job." The helicopter touched down on a landing pad marked with symbols Kestrel didn't recognize, though their meaning was clear enough. Authorized personnel only, lethal force authorized. Abandon hope all ye who enter here without proper clearance levels. Ground crew approached with the efficient movements of people who'd learned that hesitation in this environment could prove permanently educational. General Hoffman's voice crackled through the headset as the rotors wound down. "Briefing room Alpha 7 in 10 minutes. Bring your appetite for bad news and your tolerance for impossible missions." Kestrel unbuckled her harness, muscle memory guiding her through post-flight procedures she'd performed thousands of times in previous lives. The air outside tasted of jet fuel and ozone, familiar flavors that reminded her cells what they'd been designed to do before 8 years of faculty meetings had convinced them otherwise. A junior officer approached, saluting with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been practicing. "Ma'am, Admiral Morrison requests your immediate presence in the classified briefing facility. He said to tell you the South China Sea situation has evolved." South China Sea. The words hit like ice water in her veins. 8 years ago, she'd been flying a reconnaissance mission over those same waters when everything had gone sideways. When 3 aircraft had launched missiles that shouldn't have existed at targets that weren't supposed to be there. When Nightingale had supposedly been shot down and killed, her death certificate filed alongside thousands of other classified casualties. Except she hadn't died. She'd been pulled out by assets so black they didn't have names, debriefed by officers who didn't officially exist, and given a choice: stay dead and disappear into academic anonymity, or face court-martial for knowing too much about projects that had never been approved by Congress or acknowledged by the Pentagon. She'd chosen death. Professor Nakamura had been born from Nightingale's grave, complete with manufactured academic credentials and a carefully constructed background that would satisfy the most thorough investigation. 8 years of teaching political science to undergraduates who thought warfare was something that happened in video games and history textbooks. But the South China Sea had apparently not finished with her yet. The briefing room was buried 3 levels underground, accessible only through checkpoints that verified retinal patterns, fingerprints, and genetic markers. Kestrel's clearance had remained active despite her official death, a detail that suggested someone had been planning this reunion for years. Admiral Morrison looked older than his years, gray hair thin enough to reveal scalp marked by worry lines that hadn't been there during their last meeting. Behind him, wall-mounted displays showed satellite imagery of the disputed waters where her military career had supposedly ended in a fireball of classified debris. Nightingale. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 8 years keeping secrets that wanted to destroy the world. "Thank you for coming back. Didn't realize I had a choice, sir." "You didn't. None of us do." He gestured toward the displays, where real-time satellite feeds showed something that made Kestrel's training and experience feel suddenly inadequate. 3 hours ago, fishing vessels in the South China Sea began reporting aircraft that move without engines and emit no heat signature. Aircraft that appear on visual contact but don't register on any radar system currently deployed by any military force on Earth. The display zoomed in, revealing grainy footage shot by terrified fishermen. Triangular craft moving in impossible formations, their movements too smooth and coordinated to be human-piloted, too advanced to be terrestrial technology. They cast shadows on the ocean's surface but generated no electromagnetic signature whatsoever. "Sir, with respect, this looks like the aircraft that shot you down 8 years ago, except now there are more of them, and they're not hiding anymore." Kestrel stared at the footage, memory fragments falling into place like classified puzzle pieces. The mission 8 years ago hadn't been routine reconnaissance. It had been first contact with technology that shouldn't exist, piloted by intelligence that hadn't originated on Earth. The cover-up hadn't been about protecting state secrets. It had been about preventing global panic over the discovery that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. Admiral Morrison continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "The craft you encountered 8 years ago were scouts, long-range reconnaissance, testing our defensive capabilities and technological development. We've spent the intervening years preparing for their return with better sensors, improved countermeasures, and pilots trained specifically for this type of engagement. And now they're back. In force. 17 craft confirmed, with more appearing every few hours. They're not hiding anymore, Nightingale. They're announcing their presence. The question is whether they're here to establish formal contact or begin preliminary operations for something we don't want to contemplate." The wall display switched to global military deployments, showing American, Chinese, Russian, and Allied forces moving into positions that suggested everyone knew something the civilian population didn't. Aircraft carriers changing course toward the disputed waters, missile defense systems going online across 3 continents, space-based assets being repositioned for optimal coverage of the contact zone. "What's my role in this, sir? I've been out of the game for 8 years. There have to be pilots with more recent experience, better knowledge of current systems and tactics." Admiral Morrison's expression was grim. "You're the only pilot who's encountered these craft and lived to develop countermeasures. Your mission data from 8 years ago has been the foundation for every defensive system we've developed since then. The X-47 Phantom has been modified based on your combat reports, equipped with weapons and sensors designed specifically to engage non-terrestrial technology." Kestrel felt the weight of 8 years of peaceful academic life settling around her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd been teaching students about the theory of international relations, while the reality of interplanetary relations was evolving in classified briefing rooms, where her supposed death had become the cornerstone of humanity's defense strategy. "Sir, I need to ask, when you faked my death 8 years ago, was it to protect me from court-martial or to protect me from whatever, was piloting those craft?" The Admiral's pause was longer than protocol demanded. "Both. The technology you encountered that day was scanning our aircraft, downloading flight characteristics, pilot responses, weapons capabilities. It was learning from us, Nightingale. We couldn't risk them learning more from their most successful opponent." Through the briefing room's classified displays, real-time intelligence showed the impossible craft maintaining perfect formation above international waters, neither advancing nor retreating, simply waiting. Their presence was a message written in physics that transcended human language. "We are here, we are capable, and we are ready for whatever comes next." Kestrel's training told her to analyze the tactical situation, develop engagement protocols, identify weakness in enemy formations. But her 8 years in academia had taught her something equally valuable. Sometimes the most important question wasn't how to win a fight, but whether the fight needed to happen at all. Admiral, has anyone tried talking to them? The question hung in the recycled air of the briefing room like classified smoke. Around the table, officers whose careers had been built on the assumption that superior firepower could solve any problem looked uncomfortable with the implications of diplomacy, with forces that made human military technology look like stone axes. Admiral Morrison's response was measured, careful. All attempts at communication have been met with silence. Radio transmissions, laser communications, even mathematical sequences that should transcend language barriers. They acknowledge our presence. Their formations adjust when our aircraft approach, but they don't respond to any contact attempts. Maybe they're waiting for the right messenger. Or maybe they're preparing for something that doesn't require conversation. The wall displays updated with new intelligence as they spoke. More craft appearing through what the technical analysts were calling atmospheric discontinuities, tiers in reality where physics became negotiable and impossible things, stepped through into the mundane world of human conflict. Kestrel studied the formations, her pilot's eye recognizing patterns that ground-based analysts might miss. The craft weren't random in their positioning. They were establishing a perimeter, creating overlapping fields of observation that covered every military installation within a 1,000-mile radius. Whatever their intentions, they were being methodical about intelligence gathering. "Sir, when do I fly?" "As soon as you're ready. The X-47 has been upgraded with everything we've learned about engaging non-terrestrial technology. New weapons systems, enhanced defensive countermeasures, and something our technical people are calling probability armor. Don't ask me to explain it, because I don't understand it myself." Admiral Morrison handed her a classified folder marked with symbols that looked more like mathematical equations than security designations. "Your mission parameters are flexible by necessity. Primary objective: establish contact with the unidentified craft. Secondary objective: gather intelligence on their capabilities and intentions. Tertiary objective: if they prove hostile, demonstrate that humanity is not defenseless." Kestrel opened the folder, her eyes scanning mission details that read more like science fiction than military planning. Rules of engagement for entities that might not understand human concepts of warfare. Communication protocols for intelligence that had evolved beyond the need for language. Weapons systems designed to function in environments where the laws of physics might be more suggestions than absolute rules. The reality of her situation crystallized like ice forming on aircraft wings at altitude. She was being asked to serve as humanity's representative in a first contact scenario that could determine the future of human civilization. No pressure. "Sir, there's something else I need to know. 8 years ago, when I encountered these craft, I got the distinct impression they were familiar with human technology, like they'd been studying us for a long time before that first contact." "How long?" Admiral Morrison's expression suggested he'd been hoping she wouldn't ask that question. Intelligence estimates vary. Conservative analysis suggests decades. Some of our more speculative assessments reach back centuries. The implications hit like turbulence in clear air. If these entities had been observing humanity for centuries, then every major technological advancement, every military development, every strategic innovation in human history might have been witnessed, cataloged, and analyzed by intelligence far superior to anything Earth could produce. Humanity wasn't making first contact. They were finally meeting their long-term research subjects face to face. The briefing room's climate control system hummed with mechanical precision, but Kestrel felt the chill of interstellar space seeping through reinforced concrete and classified steel. Outside this underground facility, the world continued its daily routines, unaware that the most important conversation in human history was about to take place at 30,000 feet above disputed waters, where international law met cosmic possibility. Admiral Morrison closed his briefing folder with the finality of someone who'd exhausted all conventional options. Nightingale, I won't lie to you. This mission has a high probability of going badly wrong in ways we can't predict or prepare for. If you want to return to your academic life, now is the time to say so. Kestrel thought about her students, about faculty meetings and tenure reviews, and all the mundane concerns that had filled her days since leaving military service. None of it seemed real compared to the weight of what waited above the South China Sea. Her comfortable life as Professor Nakamura had always been borrowed time anyway. When do we launch? Wheels up in 2 hours. Flight time to the contact zone is classified, but plan on being in the air for longer than any mission you've flown before. As the briefing concluded, technical specialists began filing into the room, their arms filled with equipment manuals and system specifications that would transform Kestrel from academic back into the weapon she'd been designed to be. The X-47 Phantom waited on the tarmac above, its quantum-enhanced systems powered up for a mission that would either establish humanity's place in a larger universe or demonstrate that some secrets were buried for the protection of everyone who might dig them up. Professor Nakamura walked into that briefing room. Nightingale would walk out. The transformation began immediately. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos had maintained the X-47 Phantom for 8 years, keeping every system flight-ready against the possibility of Nightingale's return. Her hands moved across the aircraft's control surfaces with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, checking connections and calibrating sensors that existed at the bleeding edge of human technology. She's been lonely, Santos said as Kestrel approached the aircraft. Smart aircraft get restless when they're not being flown by pilots who understand them. Kestrel ran her fingers along the Phantom's wing route, feeling the subtle vibration of systems cycling through pre-flight diagnostics. The aircraft's skin was warm to the touch, quantum processors generating heat signatures that made it seem almost alive. 8 years ago, she'd thought of it as an extension of her nervous system. Now, approaching it felt like greeting an old friend who'd been keeping dangerous secrets. What modifications have been made? Everything. Santos opened an access panel, revealing circuitry that looked more biological than electronic. The weapons systems now include directed energy weapons calibrated for non-terrestrial targets. The defensive suite incorporates probability mathematics. The aircraft can exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously, making it effectively impossible to target with conventional weapons. Kestrel stared at the quantum processors, their surfaces rippling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. And the unconventional weapons. That's where it gets interesting. We don't know what conventional means when dealing with entities that might have different relationships with physics than we do. The pre-flight inspection revealed modifications that pushed the X-47 beyond the boundaries of terrestrial technology. Navigation systems that incorporated dimensional mathematics. Communication arrays designed to function across multiple reality states simultaneously. And nestled in the weapons bay, devices that Santos could describe but not explain. The technical manuals are classified above my clearance level, Santos admitted. I can tell you how to activate them, but not how they work or what they'll do when you pull the trigger. Kestrel's pilot training rebelled against the idea of flying with weapons she didn't understand. But her 8 years in academia had taught her that sometimes the most important knowledge came from embracing uncertainty rather than demanding explanations. The flight suit Santos handed her was unlike anything she'd worn during active service. The material felt alive, responding to her body temperature and pulse rate, integrating with her nervous system in ways that made the distinction between pilot and aircraft increasingly irrelevant. "It's a neural interface," Santos explained, helping her with connections that plugged directly into ports at the base of her skull. "The aircraft's AI will merge with your consciousness during combat operations. You'll think at the speed of quantum processors and react with reflexes enhanced by probability calculations." The implications were both exhilarating and terrifying. Kestrel had always prided herself on maintaining the boundary between human judgment and mechanical precision. The enhanced flight suit would eliminate that boundary entirely, transforming her into something that was neither fully human nor purely artificial. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the classified airfield, Kestrel completed her final systems check. The X-47 Phantom hummed beneath her, its quantum engines generating harmonics that made nearby aircraft seem primitive by comparison. Every surface rippled with energy patterns that existed partially outside normal space-time, making the aircraft simultaneously present and absent, real and theoretical. The radio crackled with final mission authorization. "Nightingale, you are cleared for immediate departure. Contact zone is currently clear of civilian traffic. International airspace has been temporarily restricted by mutual agreement among all major powers." Kestrel taxied toward the runway, the Phantom's landing gear retracting with mechanical precision that felt more like organic transformation. At rotation speed, the aircraft lifted with an impossibly smooth motion that suggested it wasn't so much flying as convincing reality to move out of its way. Climbing through cloud layers toward the contact zone, Kestrel felt her consciousness expanding to accommodate the aircraft's enhanced sensory capabilities. She could perceive electromagnetic spectra beyond human vision, detect gravitational anomalies that registered as colors she had no names for, sense probability fluctuations that manifested as musical harmonies in dimensions she couldn't conceptualize. The neural interface was more intimate than she'd expected, connecting her not just to the aircraft's systems, but to its accumulated experiences. The Phantom had memories of previous flights, archived sensory data from encounters with phenomena that officially didn't exist. As they climbed toward the contact zone, Kestrel began accessing those memories, learning from previous pilots who'd pushed the boundaries of what human consciousness could encompass. At 20,000 feet, her enhanced sensors detected the first anomaly. Space itself seemed to ripple ahead, reality becoming negotiable in ways that made her navigation system struggle to maintain coherent readings. The unknown craft were affecting local physics simply by existing, their presence creating distortions that propagated outward like ripples in a pond made of spacetime itself. "Control, Nightingale. I'm detecting significant gravitational anomalies ahead. The contact zone appears to be experiencing localized reality distortion." "Copy that, Nightingale. Proceed with caution. You are now the only human in direct sensor range of the unidentified craft." 30,000 feet. The sky ahead shimmered like heat mirages over summer asphalt, but these distortions were cold, angular, precise. Through the optical distortion, she could see them. 17 craft arranged in a formation that followed mathematical principles her brain couldn't quite process. They hung in the sky like black holes cut into geometric shapes, absorbing light and radio waves while radiating something that wasn't quite energy in any spectrum human science had cataloged. The neural interface fed her data that bypassed conscious interpretation, downloading directly into her enhanced awareness. The craft were approximately 50 meters in length, triangular in cross-section, with surfaces that reflected and absorbed electromagnetic radiation in patterns that suggested active camouflage systems operating across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. But more importantly, they were beautiful. That realization hit her like spatial disorientation in a high-G turn. Despite their alien geometry and impossible physics, the craft possessed an aesthetic harmony that spoke to something deeper than rational analysis. They moved through three-dimensional space like music made visible, their formations creating patterns that resonated with mathematical principles older than human civilization. Control Nightingale. Visual contact established. 17 craft in defensive formation, maintaining position approximately 5,000 feet above sea level. No immediate hostile action detected. As she closed to within visual range, the craft began to move. Not toward her or away, but in a complex dance that reminded her of murmurations of starlings, individual units moving in perfect coordination to create larger patterns that served purposes she couldn't identify. Their movement was simultaneously mechanical and organic, following laws of physics that included variables her scientific training hadn't prepared her to recognize. The radio remained silent as she approached. Her attempts at communication met with the same lack of response that had frustrated previous contact attempts. But something else was happening, something her instruments couldn't measure but her enhanced consciousness could perceive directly. The craft were communicating, just not through electromagnetic radiation or any medium human science recognized. Information flowed between them in patterns that bypassed physical reality, using quantum entanglement and dimensional mathematics to share data instantaneously across impossible distances. And now they were communicating with her. The contact wasn't auditory or visual. It bypassed her sensory organs entirely, downloading directly into her consciousness through the neural interface that connected her to the Phantom's quantum processors. Not words or images, but pure information that reorganized itself into concepts she could understand. Welcome back, Nightingale. Kestrel's hands tightened on the controls as the implications of that greeting registered. They knew her call sign. They knew she'd survived the encounter 8 years ago. They had been waiting specifically for her return. The communication continued, flowing into her awareness like water finding its level. We have been observing your species for a duration you would measure as centuries. Your technological development has reached a threshold that requires direct intervention. The individual designated Nightingale demonstrated compatibility with enhanced consciousness during previous contact. You have been selected to serve as an intermediary. Intermediary for what? The concept that flowed into her mind was complex, layered with implications that her human consciousness could barely process even with quantum enhancement. The entities weren't invaders or conquerors. They were gardeners, tending to the development of consciousness throughout the galaxy, intervening only when emerging species reached critical thresholds that determined whether they would evolve into something greater or destroy themselves through technological adolescence. Humanity had reached such a threshold. The craft around her began to move in patterns that her enhanced awareness recognized as formal presentation protocols. They were introducing themselves, not as individuals, but as manifestations of a collective intelligence that had evolved beyond the need for separate identity. Each craft was simultaneously one entity and part of a larger whole, their consciousness distributed across quantum states that allowed them to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. Through the neural link, she felt her own consciousness beginning to expand, to encompass perceptual frameworks that stretched beyond human limitations. The boundary between her individual awareness and the aircraft's quantum processors dissolved, then reformed at a higher level that included access to information networks spanning galactic distances. She was becoming something more than human, something that could serve as a bridge between terrestrial consciousness and intelligences that had evolved beyond the constraints of single-planet existence. The transformation wasn't forced. She could resist it, maintain her purely human perspective, and return to the safety of academic life. But the choice felt like turning away from the sun to stare at shadows on a cave wall. Kestrel embraced the expansion. Her consciousness exploded outward, encompassing not just the local contact zone, but the entire network of intelligence that stretched across interstellar distances. She could perceive other worlds where similar threshold species were being evaluated, other gardeners working to guide emerging consciousness toward its full potential. Earth was one of thousands of worlds reaching critical development phases simultaneously, part of a galactic awakening that had been building for millennia. Through the enhanced awareness, she understood the true scope of the choice facing humanity. The quantum technologies that had enabled the X-47's advanced capabilities were based on principles that could lead either to transcendence or extinction. Used wisely, they would enable humanity to join the galactic community of evolved consciousness. Used destructively, they would ensure that human civilization destroyed itself before it could spread beyond Earth. The entities had intervened because humanity was approaching this threshold faster than any previous species they'd encountered, developing quantum technologies and artificial intelligence capabilities at a pace that didn't allow for the gradual wisdom that usually accompanied such power. They needed a human representative who could understand both perspectives, someone who could help guide humanity's next evolutionary step without forcing the choice through conquest or manipulation. They needed Nightingale. As her consciousness stabilized at its new level of enhancement, Kestrel became aware of the broader strategic situation. The 17 craft above the South China Sea were only a small fraction of the entity's presence in the solar system. Larger vessels waited in the outer system, monitoring not just Earth but the development of consciousness throughout the local galactic region. Humanity's response to this first open contact would determine whether they were ready for membership in the galactic community, or required more time to develop the wisdom necessary to handle advanced technology responsibly. The choice was collective, but it would be influenced by individual decision made by people who found themselves at the intersection of human and post-human consciousness. People like her. The communication from the entities carried a new layer of information, instructions and capability that downloaded into her enhanced awareness like software updates for consciousness itself. She was being equipped to serve as humanity's representative in negotiations that would determine the future of terrestrial civilization. But first, she needed to return to Earth and explain to political and military leaders that everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the universe was about to change. The X-47 Phantom began its descent toward the classified airfield, carrying within its quantum-enhanced systems the most important intelligence briefing in human history. Behind them, the 17 craft maintained their formation, waiting patiently for humanity's response to an invitation they'd been extending for centuries. Whether that response would be acceptance or rejection remained to be seen, but now, at least, the conversation could finally begin. As the aircraft touched down on the runway where her academic life had ended, and her role as interspecies ambassador had begun, Kestrel realized that Professor Nakamura and Nightingale had both died during the mission. What was returning to Earth was something new, something that carried within its enhanced consciousness the responsibility for guiding an entire species through its next evolutionary threshold. The real work was about to begin. The debriefing room felt smaller after experiencing consciousness that spanned galactic distances. Admiral Morrison, General Hoffman, and a collection of officials whose titles were more classified than their names sat around a conference table that seemed designed for purely human concerns: national security, territorial boundaries, military advantages that meant nothing to entities who had evolved beyond the need for nations or territories. Kestrel's enhanced awareness perceived their fear as electromagnetic patterns that flickered around their heads like coronas of anxiety. The neural interface had become permanent during her contact with the entities, transforming her into something that was technically still human, but functionally something else entirely. Nightingale, Admiral Morrison began, his voice carefully controlled. "We need a complete mission report. What were their intentions? What do they want from us?" "They want us to grow up." The statement hung in the recycled air like classified smoke. Around the table, career military officers who'd spent decades preparing for every conceivable threat struggled to process the implications of contact with intelligences that treated humanity's greatest weapon systems as interesting but primitive tools. Elaborate, General Hoffman said. Kestrel accessed the information downloads she'd received, translating concepts that existed beyond human language into words that could fit inside purely terrestrial consciousness. They've been monitoring human development for centuries, waiting for us to reach what they call a threshold moment, the point where a species either evolves beyond its destructive impulses or destroys itself trying. She gestured toward the wall displays, which now showed global military deployments that seemed pathetically inadequate compared to the technologies she'd witnessed. Every major technological advancement in human history, nuclear weapons, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, has been observed and cataloged by intelligences that mastered those technologies millennia ago. Are they a threat? The question revealed the fundamental limitation of purely human perspective. Even enhanced by quantum interfaces and expanded consciousness, Kestrel struggled to explain concepts that transcended the binary thinking that dominated military planning. There,